Now we're continuing in our series on the life of Joseph. God intended it for good, and we're coming this evening to Genesis 40 through to verse 13 of 41, looking at shattered hopes and dreams. We're going to split the message and the reading into two parts, and have a song and testimony between them. So we're going to come to our first reading now. Our first reading is Genesis 40, verses 1 through to 11. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." Okay, so let's come to shattered hopes and dreams. Shattered hopes and dreams. Everyone has hopes and dreams. That's perfectly normal. Some are grander than others. They often give a sense of direction to our lives. They start with children when they play make-believe games. You know, when they start dressing up, doctors, nurses, vets, mum, dad, astronaut, singer, footballer, all these kind of things. As they get a bit older, then things perhaps develop a bit further. And they might dream for good exam results, or to have a good job, a happy marriage, good children. But the fact is, often hopes and dreams get shattered. Sometimes they are shattered overnight, very suddenly, something happens. Hopes and dreams are shattered. Sometimes it's more slowly than that, and just one thing after another breaks those hopes and dreams down until again they are shattered. Well, Joseph, as we come to him in chapter 40, has every right to think that his hopes and dreams have been shattered. I mean, he's in prison, of all places. He's there even though he did nothing wrong. He's been falsely accused, basically, of rape. He's there in prison despite having had 2 literal dreams that were God-given, that Joseph understood as from God, with a particular meaning, that he was one day going to be a very important person, and more important than the rest of his family, that one day they would all come bow down before him. And yet here he is in prison. His hopes and dreams are shattered. And of course, Moses, when he's writing the book of Genesis, is writing to a people who had, over generations and even in their lifetime, experienced shattered hopes and dreams. They'd been in bondage, in slavery in Egypt for 400 years. Then they'd had the great act of God. There was the Exodus, the release, the setting of freedom, where they're able to come out of of Egypt, and they were to head to their promised land. But then in the wilderness, everything went wrong, and they ended up having to wander around the wilderness for 40 years until one generation had died out. And then they head towards the borders of Canaan again, and their hopes are up. And the fact is, as Moses speaks to them at that point, the reality is their hopes will not always be up. It won't always be great. Things are going to be difficult again. They're going to be up and down, up and down. They're going to have hopes and dreams, and at times they are going to be shattered. That's what Moses is dealing with here. And we need to recognize this is a fact of life. It's a fact of life in a broken, fallen, sinful world. It's a fact not only of life in general, but even a fact of our spiritual life. Our walk with God. It's not all upwards. It's not all onwards. It's not all progress. Our life with God, even our life together as a church in fellowship with one another. Genesis 40 into 41 gives us a real and much needed dose of reality of how to cope with shattered hopes and dreams. Now, the first thing I want us to see is rainbow in the rain. You know how beautiful rainbows are, but you never get one without the rain. In a sense, we might think we'd love to see a rainbow without the rain, but actually, in a sense, it's the contrast that makes it so beautiful. That there's the sun shining just after or during the time of rain, and this splendid rainbow is displayed in the sky, and it is absolutely amazing. It's breathtaking. Well, when all our hopes and dreams seem to be shattered, or even when all our hopes and dreams are shattered, when the rain has been pouring, don't we think it would be lovely to see a rainbow? To see some beautiful sign of God's presence? Well, maybe that's what Joseph received in these opening verses of chapter 40, when it says, after he's been put in prison sometime later, we don't know exactly how long, quite a while probably, it sounds like it, probably not years. When you do the maths of the book of Genesis, it's probably not years, but sometime later. Imagine every day in prison, particularly in prison where you didn't have health and safety inspections and standards that were governed by an outside body. That every day would count, every day would be awful. But sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. Well, these men aren't necessarily VIPs in the top sense of that, but these are influential people who have been brought into contact, into connection with Joseph. What a rainbow that is coming here. Sorry if this is a spoiler, but I'm aware that most of you have probably read the book of Genesis before. These people, well, one of them, is eventually going to lead to Joseph's release. So what a rainbow this will indeed turn out to be. But think how God has orchestrated every aspect of this for this to happen. You know, it just so happened that the chief cupbearer and the chief baker offended the king. It so happened that the king got angry. It so happened that he was so angry with them that he had them thrown into prison. It so happened that was the very same prison that Joseph was in. It so happened that the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph. And each of those, it just so happened, could have been different, except God was ordering it. You know, They didn't need to offend the king. The king didn't need to get that angry. They could have been sent to other prisons. Joseph didn't need to be the one attending, but God orchestrated all of this. God was in control, putting the right people in the right place at the right time. That was the beginning of a rainbow in the rain for Joseph. And we can see from this that the rainbow for you and I and Joseph is to know that God is intimately involved in the detail of our lives. When we think of Romans 8 and verse 28, that God does all things according to his good pleasure, to work every detail out for us. Romans 8 verse 28 is such an incredible promise for us to grasp hold of, such an encouragement for us to believe in, and that's what we need to do even at a time like this. It says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. In all things God works for the good, not in most things, not in some things, but in absolutely all things. Now, if it's raining in your life at the moment, you might well say, but I don't see it. I don't see the rainbow. I don't see God working in all things. Well, let me tell you a simple thing about a rainbow. You never see a rainbow when you're looking down at the floor. You never see a rainbow when you're looking down. You've got to look up. You've got to look up into the sky. And perhaps that says something to us in terms of our relationship with God. We've got to look up. We've got to look to the Lord. We've got to be looking to him in faith. We've got to be looking to him, trusting him that he will keep his promise. And therefore believing that he is working all things together for the good of those who love him. We need to believe that. You've got to say, in response to our desire to see the rainbow, to see it now, why have we got that? Is seeing really believing? That certainly isn't what the Bible speaks of when it talks about faith. It says in Hebrews 11 and verse 1 that faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Do you get that? Faith is confidence and assurance about what we do not see. We need to trust. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7 tells us we walk by faith and not by sight. And so, although it is wonderful when God gives us a real glimpse of a rainbow, we've got to trust that God is working it out so that there will be a rainbow, that there is a hidden rainbow maybe, that God is fulfilling his promises, that he will not fail in those promises. Secondly, let's look at firm faith. How much of the rainbow Joseph really saw as these two men enter prison is hard to be certain of. But whatever he did see, what we see of him is very much a firm faith in prison. And I think his firm faith is seen in two different ways. One is his firm faith is seen in the steady service. You notice that in verse 4 it says the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph and he attended them after they had been in custody for some time. So there is Joseph in prison, unjustly condemned, and he is serving these two men who've just been thrown into prison. Now, there's little comment about that, but it is amazing, isn't it? You know, it's how he started in prison. If you go back to the previous chapter, pick up at the end of verse 20 of chapter 39, it says, while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warder. So the warder put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. So he started by serving well, but can't you imagine that after days and days and weeks of being there in this horrible prison, that it would have been easy to think, oh, forget it, I'm just going to look after myself. But that's not what he does. He keeps on serving. 2 prisoners arrive, they're assigned to him, he serves. There's steady service. And our calling in 1 Corinthians 15:58 is to be steadfast and immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. And you know, to do that day after day is an act of faith. To just keep steadily serving the Lord. Now you might say, but I'm not doing the work of the Lord, aren't you? Or wasn't Joseph doing the work of the Lord here in prison? There's nothing glamorous to it. It's very ordinary. It didn't have a special title to it particularly. It wouldn't be on the church notice board or in the bulletin sheet or anything like that. He just served those who were in his sphere of life. And that is what we need to be doing, steadily serving the Lord. That takes firm faith, particularly in the ordinary, everyday activities of serving people. And then I think we see it in another aspect. These 2 men, as we read, each had a dream. They had a dream. And they were miserable the next morning. Joseph asked them, the end of verse 7, why do you look so sad today? Their response is, we both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Now then, Joseph has a bit of a past history with dreams, doesn't he? So he says, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Now you might say, what's so special about that? You know, he'd had 2 dreams, he believed they were from God, and so why shouldn't he say to them, tell me your dreams, I'll interpret them, they come from God? Well, yes, he'd interpreted those dreams of his own, but where had that got him now? You know, as far as interpreting dreams are concerned, we might say to Joseph, don't give up your day job. This has not turned out well for you, Joseph. And more seriously, you may say, Joseph would have every reason to think that God is not in the dream business at all. His dreams were given by God, but his dreams were that he was going to be one day a very important person, and now he's in prison, languishing in prison. So with that in mind, listen to him say, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Isn't that firm faith? A faith which has persisted when he could have given up on God. He could have given up on dreams. He could have given up on God being able to interpret dreams by now, because everything looked a mess for him. That's firm faith. That is firm faith. And that's what God wants to see when our hopes and dreams are shattered. He wants to see firm faith. Katie is going to read for us now our second reading, beginning at Genesis 40 and verse 12.
This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favourable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to him in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up, fell asleep again, and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled. So he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled."
Thank you very much, Kate. So our third point is hope springs eternal. Hope springs eternal. You see, Joseph explains the dreams in verses 12 through to 19 to the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. The crux of them are found in these words. This is to the chief cupbearer: "Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." And then the conclusion to the chief baker was, "Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat your flesh." Good news for one, bad news, very bad news for the other. But you see, Joseph has stepped out in faith. He's interpreted the dreams. But what if he's wrong? His dreams then won't just be shattered; they'd be crushed. He's disappointed with how his own dreams haven't come to fruition yet. But if these 2 dreams he understands incorrectly, his dreams would be crushed. You can only imagine the 3 anxious days that there must have been for the chief cupbearer, and shall we say particularly for the chief baker, and very really for Joseph as well, as they waited for this 3rd day that was indicated by both of those dreams. And then when the 3rd day comes, it's Pharaoh's birthday. He throws a party in his own honor. Only pharaohs do that, don't they? He has his own birthday party. He throws the party, and everything turns out just as Joseph has said. How that must have given Joseph hope springing eternally within his heart, how it must have strengthened his faith to believe that his dreams are now going to be fulfilled. The chief cupbearer, the chief baker, their dreams have been fulfilled. The cupbearer has got his job back. He's going to speak to Pharaoh. That's the request that Joseph has made of him. How it must have helped Joseph to keep looking to God to fulfill not dreams in that worldly sense, in the sense that we might hope to be this or hope to be that, but to fulfill the dreams that God had given to him, as God had now fulfilled the dreams that he'd given to the cupbearer. What can help hope spring eternally in us for God to fulfill that promise we looked at earlier, that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him? What will help keep us believing that when the storms come, when the rain is pouring, when, as we've just heard, day after day, year after year, and for Beck, a whole string of what should we say, some kind of what she described as average things, but also some really big things came along, but the cumulative effect was a terrible downpour. What keeps us believing? What keeps us believing? What gives us hope springing in our hearts? Well, I think to remember what God has done for others and for you, for me, in the past, is a great help. Here we have it in Scripture. These events when God does it, when God does something, when he steps in, keeping his promises, he stirs up hope, and we can stir up our hope from our memories to remember times when God has done us or others good in the past, and we can see it and remember it. But I think actually there's more as well. When we go back to Romans 8, the chapter of that great promise that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, there's a response to that, and it gives us greater help to have hope springing up in our hearts. The Romans 8 verse 31 says, what then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? And some of us might be ready to chip in at that point and say, a whole load of people and a whole load of situations can be against us, it seems to me, even if God is for us. But the Apostle Paul quickly steps in before we hardly get those words off our lips and says to us in the very next verse, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? And so, as Beck was saying, going back to the cross, going back to that greatest event in history, that thing that it should be deeply etched in our memories of the greatest evidence of God's love for us. He gave his son up to the cross for us. That should help us believe. If he did that, then he'll do whatever we need today. If he hasn't spared his son, won't he do everything that we need? Most surely he will. Hope springs eternal. And then finally, and they all lived, and I'm sure you can fill in the dots in this heading, it's such a well-known phrase, and they all lived happily ever after. Or did they? What a day it must have been when this cupbearer got his job back. Despite shattered hopes and dreams for Joseph, there has been a rainbow for him, proving that God is in control of in the detail, that proving that God isn't distant, that God isn't distant for his people. We've seen the shining example of firm faith in Joseph's behavior and explicit faith in prison, and how God has given him good reason for hope to spring eternal, with the cupbearer getting his job back. And to be honest, now we expect, don't we? If we were reading this chapter for the first time, we expect. And they all lived happily ever after. that the cupbearer would get his job back. He'd go to the Pharaoh on day 1 or day 2. He'd have a word in the king's ear and mention Joseph, and the king would have him released from prison. After all, he was there unjustly. That's what we expect. But that isn't how it happens. I mean, it was only a small thing that Joseph had asked of him, just a small thing to ask that he would actually have a word with the king, that he would speak to him. But verse 23, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. And we might be shouting out, what are you doing? And Moses writing says it again. He forgot him. He forgot him. What a terrible, terrible thing. How long for, we might be saying? A day, 2 days, a week, a month? Verse 1 of chapter 2, when 2 full years had passed. And that's what's going to lead to the cupbearer actually remembering Joseph and saying in the lame way that he does, that he's remembering, he's reminded, verse 9, of his shortcomings. Is that all it was? Shortcomings? Joseph has been in prison another 2 years, Mr. Cupbearer, just because you couldn't be bothered to remember. 2 years Joseph stays in prison, 730 days, 17,520 hours, 1,051,200 minutes. Do you think Joseph counted every one? You could imagine it. Joseph is stuck there in prison, forgotten by the cupbearer. Was he forgotten by God? You could imagine him feeling that. I mean, have you noticed, I'll draw your attention to it now if you haven't, but have you noticed the stark contrast there is between chapter 39 that we looked at last week, for part of the time, and now this whole section, all of chapter 40 and the first 13 verses of chapter 41. The big difference is that there is no mention of the Lord or God in this whole passage. I mean, in the previous passage, we had it time and time again. Verse 2, the chapter 39, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. Verse 3, when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything. The chapter continues like that. My count is that there's probably another 7 ways there are explicit statements of the Lord being with and prospering and helping and keeping Joseph in that chapter. In this whole passage, not one mention, except for the eagle-eyed among you, in Joseph's statement of faith. Joseph brings God into the equation when he is told the 2 dreams of the cupbearer and the baker, and he says, do not interpretations belong to God? But none of these amazing statements of how God was with Joseph here. Did he feel forgotten? I mean, couldn't God, the God who controlled the way the cupbearer and the baker had annoyed the king, the way the king was angry enough to put them in prison, the way that they ended up in the same prison as Joseph, the way that the guard put them into Joseph's care, couldn't the God who controlled all of those details also just control the cupbearer's memory for 1 minute, to just prompt him to remember Joseph? Well, of course he could. God could do that. But he didn't do it. And you know, that is life. There is so much that God could do that we would leap for joy at. But in his infinite wisdom and grace and love, where he knows better than us, where he is working all things, even the cupbearer's forgetting of Joseph, where he works them all for good, there are times where God just doesn't do what we expect. Until 2 years later, Pharaoh has 2 dreams. And then the cupbearer says, oh, you know what? I'm reminded of my shortcomings. We often live in the 2 years. That is the place we are often at. Think of Moses writing this book. He never saw the promised land. He never entered the promised land himself. Wasn't there a sense in which he was in the 2 years? He ended in that period where 40 years of wandering, he leaves the people on the border ready to cross into the land, but he doesn't go with them. Israel, even though they went into the land, they never possessed all of the land that God had promised to them. That is so often life. We believe the promise that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. We don't always see the fullness of that in this life. And what it should do for us is lead us to look for a better place, a better time when all God's believing people will, without any sentimentality or the tripe that the phrase often comes from, and all God's believing people will genuinely live happily ever after.